This is Winston Pilcher Folk. I was born in Knoxville on High Street in 1901. High Street is now 6th Avenue. I was born about 2 doors from Church Street.
Now I want to talk about you. When did you graduate from the Naval Academy?
I graduated in 1923.
And what was your first assignment, your first duty?
Put the West Virginia into commission. That made me a plank owner in the West Virginia.
And your rank at that time?
Ensign. I was an ensign at the time.
How long were you on the West Virginia? And then just go ahead and tell me all the things you did after that.
Well, I was in West Virginia only 3 or 4 months when I got tabbed to go to put a cruiser, old cruiser, Galveston, in commission.
And then you stayed on the Galveston, and then weren't you in China for a long time?
Oh yeah, a long time after that. It was, Galveston was put in commission to take the place of USS Tacoma, which had foundered on some rocks in the Caribbean and was lost. Galveston was part of the Special Service Squadron based on Panama. They should have had a white diamond on its sack, which I believe was the United Fruit Company insignia, because we were mainly there to protect the United Fruit Company's investments. Bananas.
Oh, mainly bananas.
Bananas.
Well, now, when coming up to World War II, what was your first duty? Well, tell me where you were at the time World War II began.
Well, there's an awful lot before we get to World War II.
Oh, I know it, but I'm afraid we won't have time.
All right. I was safe as a bug in a rug in Miami when the news of Pearl Harbor came to me via a truck farming woman that I called Gertie. And I don't know her name, but we had bought some vegetables from her. Were buying vegetables from her when she said, those people that came by said the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I said, I gotta go. So I went back to the radio, and it was true. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And at that time, I was a weather guesser at Naval Air Station, Miami. The Navy had sent me to CalTech, and I came out of it a meteorologist and was prepared to make it a career when I retired from the Navy, when Pearl Harbor happened, and then I had to get back in the line. And I wrote letters, personal and official, to try and get back, but all the answer came back, Bureau says they need aerologists. Finally, I took leave and flew to Washington to press my case personally. At first I got the same answer from the Bureau officer who was in control of my destiny. It's, gee, wink, we need aerologists. So I went over to Booper's and talked to them. They said, well, if you get rid of your specialty, we could send you damage control officer of a cruiser tomorrow. Well, I was a lieutenant commander then, and that was a commander's job. And I said, don't make a move, I'll be right back. So I went back to see Orville. It was after working hours, but I took a chance he was still in his office. If he wasn't, I was going to follow him to Falls Church. he was still there, and I said, "You gotta let me go." And he said, "Oh, gee, we can't run this." Well, I had an assistant who was reporting that very day, and I thought I was going to say if he could relieve me, that would make things all right. But I was afraid that Orwell would say, "No, you train him in Navy ways, and we'll just send him out to the fleet." And I had envisioned myself as an elderly lieutenant commander training additional aerologists in Navy ways and then sending them out to the fleet. So I didn't say anything about the assistant. Of a sudden, he said, "By the way, you have an assistant reporting." I said, "Yes, this very day." He said, "Well, if you could get your commanding officer to say he was prepared to, he was able to relieve you, quite relieve you, that would untie my hands." With the best poker face possible, I just indicated it was a wonderful idea. I'd been thinking of it and afraid to mention it. He said, "Well, do you think he could qualify as able to relieve you?" I said, "He's the best aerologist in the Navy." He said, "Well, you haven't seen him yet." I said, "He's the best aerologist in the Navy." He finally got the word. So with that, I went back to Miami and gave him a week or so. His name was Fleet, my assistant, and he was very, very good. And at the end of a month, I felt he was able to relieve me, so I sent in my request. And Jerry Bogan, the skipper of the station, had been much interested in my attempt to get back in the line, and so he took my word that he was able to qualify to relieve me, and I was relieved of my specialty. Then my orders came of a damage control officer of USS Birmingham to B. It was under construction in Newport News, Virginia. And I had a month's leave and went home to Nashville first, or Franklin rather, and then left Polly and the two youngsters behind and went on to Newport News, where I reported to the officer in charge of shipbuilding at Newport News.
That's when you got on the Birmingham.
Oh, I could hardly wait to see the ship, and it was quite a mess, and construction all over the place. Still a month or so from commissioning, and I spoiled a suit of whites, which I had reported, because I had to go to the ship right away. I didn't even want to change clothes. So I got pretty dirty and went back. And every day I had an opportunity to go aboard ship. And it was, Birmingham got delayed because of the interest in aircraft carriers. And that was the priority, was for aircraft carriers. And it was January of 1943 before Birmingham was put in commission. And after commissioning and crew exercises in Chesapeake Bay, we were fortunate in having a deep water area in which ships could carry out seagoing tests without having to get out into the open ocean with maybe sub-targets. after the preliminary test, Birmingham was declared ready for sea, ready for combat, and our first job was to take part in the campaign against Sicily. That was on the 10th of July, and we had opportunity to fire many salvos at Italian shore batteries and German airplanes, which attacked considerably the night of the 10th. And that enabled Birmingham, having fought Italian shore batteries and German airplanes, enabled Birmingham to have Japanese, German and Italian flags on the bridge, and later we had several Japanese flags on the bridge.
Could we skip ahead now to the time when the Birmingham was in the Pacific, and when the Princeton, when you came alongside? Could we? I know there's a lot between, but in the interest of time, I do want to have that information.
I want to tell you, Birmingham was a prize unit in the Mediterranean, and the British wanted to keep Birmingham there. And the answer came back, no. Admiral, I forget his name, the four-star admiral that was in command of naval forces in the Med, was anxious for Birmingham too, but he was not a diehard like the British. So when the first answer came back no, the British sent in very official up through the chain of command through Eisenhower to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But it got to the same man, Ernie King, and Ernie King said no. But the British are diehard. They took it up through Roosevelt, Churchill and Roosevelt, and finally sent for King and said, Ernie, what is all this about a cruiser Birmingham? He said, Mr. President, the Birmingham is scheduled for the Pacific, and the Birmingham is going to the Pacific as long as I am Chief of Naval Operations. Well, you know Roosevelt was not going to lose Ernie King on such a thing, so Birmingham went to the Pacific. After a week or two work in the Navy Yard in Norfolk, we headed for the Pacific. Where we took part in various campaigns.
Admiral Winston Folk, who was 92 years old yesterday, November 10th, 1993. We are at his home in Old Lyme, Connecticut. He was in command of the battleship Birmingham. Was it battleship or cruiser? Cruiser, Birmingham. And he's going to tell us what happened to the Birmingham after the Princeton exploded, and they rescued a number of people and took bodies from the Princeton onto the Birmingham. He's going to give us the history of the Birmingham after that time. Admiral, I'll hold the microphone and you just talk. No, I'll hold it. It's better if I hold it.
All right.
So, but Roseanne, will you push my chair up closer? Yeah.
The story of Birmingham's adventures after the Princeton explosion has never been written up. This I'm pleased to tell now. But first, a few setting the stage for the explosion. Princeton was hit by a lone Japanese plane that escaped detection by radars from the entire task force. one plane. It was hiding up in some clouds, and at one point it dropped a bomb and hit Princeton. It was a most terrible time for Princeton because thinking nothing enemy was about to happen. Princeton was in the process of rearming, refueling planes, and the deck was strewn with combustible material. The bomb hit and caused grievous fires. It was soon realized that the Princeton personnel was not capable of handling the fires, so other ships, some destroyers, and notably Birmingham, were ordered to give aid. Captain English took the ship alongside Princeton, and then Birmingham personnel climbed over onto the carrier deck and to fight the fires with our own hoses. We were successful in putting out the fire forward, and were working on a major fire that was in the after part of the ship when a underwater sound contact developed and 4 bogies were sighted, 4 enemy planes. The captain felt he had to get sea room in case they have to fight the ship, so he cast off from Birmingham and subsequently the underwater soundtrack was proved to be not a sub, and the 4 bandits or enemy planes resulted in Birmingham's first experience as fighter directorship, but we gained 4 tally-hos and 3 splashes. One of them got away. With the sound contact not hostile, the planes done away with, Captain English returned the ship to the Princeton. The Princeton, I was on the forecastle, superintending the firefighting unit, and Captain English, an excellent ship handler, seemed to be having unnecessary trouble. So I went up on the bridge to make sure I knew what was going on. And I got up there and found that the captain was just being cautious, and he was getting in. He was at an angle of perhaps 45 degrees with the bow about 50 feet abeam of Princeton. Just then, this tremendous explosion occurred. The captain and I were both knocked flat on the deck, and I personally thought I was killed. But after a few moments, I was able to get to my feet and find out that I wasn't seriously hurt. I was The captain also seemed to be all right. I helped him to his feet and then said I would better go find out the extent of the damage. He agreed. So I set out to survey the situation. I was totally unprepared for the terrible sights that I saw. Bodies without limbs, limbs without bodies, all over the main deck. The dental officer with both legs gone and was dying in front of me. Nothing could be done for him. I gathered up some morphine syrettes and sulfur drugs from my secondary dressing station in my cabin and gave my Marine orderly a bunch of the same, and we set out giving sulfur drugs and morphine syrettes. By the time I got toward the fantail, I realized I had more important things to do than to succor the wounded. I had to find out the full extent of the damage. So I gave the morphine syrettes and sulfur drugs all to the orderly and told him to go about administering them. And I was confident he could do it because thanks to our junior medical officer, M.C.A.R.T., every man on that ship knew what to do with morphine syrettes and how to administer them and how to administer sulfur drugs. Despite the extent of the damage, the morale of these troops was absolutely top hole. Oh, don't bother with me with sulfur drugs, Captain. Just hit me over the head and knock me out. And an attitude like that. Yes, even for the other fella, he was worse off than I am. I reported up, my first report was 75 killed. Next report, 125 killed. The final score was close to 300 killed outright and several hundred seriously wounded. When I got back to the bridge to make my report, I found the captain had gone below. The pain in his arm was too much for him. He had to relinquish command, and he turned it over to the gunnery officer. I'll get his name in later. And who was at the con when I arrived. I endeavored to take over the con, and he was reluctant to give it to me. Not from delusions of grandeur, but because he didn't think I was capable of assuming command. I was rather a gory mess from numerous shrapnel wounds in the front of my body and it bled all over my shirt. However, I convinced Fran Dubourg, Commander Fran Dubourg, the gunnery officer, that I was capable to take over, and he turned the command over to me. At one point, Birmingham was asked if it could take the Princeton in tow. I checked with Bosun McGrain, a fella, if there ever was one, and he said, well, if we have to do it with a can-do ship, we'll do it. But I would not recommend it. And I passed that on to the unit commander. It was finally decided that we not attempt to tow Princeton, but to torpedo Princeton and send it bottom. This was done, except that one torpedo behaved erratically and started back toward our own forces to help Princeton. Speedily, the ships engaged in helping Princeton, that had been engaged in helping Princeton, were speedily got out of the way. Eventually, Birmingham had to take a place in the task force. By that time, night had fallen, and Birmingham's position was well on the far side of the task force. And I had to thread my way past a number of ships by radar to get to a proper position. In doing that, I received perhaps the nicest compliment I have ever had, though it was not intended for me. Specifically, in Arleigh Burke's first biography, there is this paragraph in connection with the Princeton damage. The deck you can just copy out of this instead of my saying so.
Would you like me to read it or Roseanne to read it right now on the tape?
Well, all right, I'll read it.
And
Suddenly,
all right, you read it.
the nearly tamed fire had reached torpedo storage, and a fearful explosion blasted away most of Princeton's stern and after flight deck. Birmingham, alongside, with most of her crew on deck, took a deadly rain of steel and fire. In an instant, everyone still aboard Princeton was either dead or wounded. Worse yet, more than 200 on the deck of Birmingham were dead, more than 400 were injured. The deck of Birmingham was a scene of bloody horror. Burke watched and thought that Birmingham's skipper, Thomas B. English, did a wonderful job of handling his ship after the disaster. It was my pleasure to write Burke and tell him that Captain English never gave a command after the explosion, but that the handling of the ship after that explosion was entirely mine.
What page is that on in the book?
129.
129.
I called it 127. It's 129.
Oh, all right.
It was my first experience conning a ship with the help of radar. And I was fortunate in reaching Birmingham's appointed station without undue difficulty. On station, then, the Admiral decided, for instance, to come up quite properly, that Birmingham should be returned to the West Coast for overhaul. The entire starboard side of the ship was a shambles. Now this is tenet way.
All right, now, do you remember when this happened, the exact date?
44.
20th of October, 1944. And you had something else you wanted to add, to put in that you thought you should have said at the very first of the tape. That was about the...
I said that, didn't you get it?
No, you asked me to turn the tape off at that minute, so now I've got it back on, and I'd like for you to repeat that.
I wanted to say, while I was reached the fantail of Birmingham, I looked over and could see the stern of Princeton blown off with its name, Princeton, printed thereon, floating toward me. That's all.
Now, I have some more questions I would like to ask you about that. Did you, the people that had died, did you bury them at sea then?
That comes later.
Oh, it comes later, all right.
It was also decided to send two destroyers that had been crippled, similarly somewhat crippled by the explosion, to go with us. And someone else happily suggested that they sent a destroyer that was in command of all its facilities also go along, because the destroyers were minus one or two radars, and suddenly radar was out of whack. So Birmingham was assigned 3 destroyers to retire to Ulithi with instructions for the unit to fuel at Point Mick, a spot of longitude and latitude in the ocean. So sadly, Birmingham left with its 3 destroyers, 3 destroyer escort, sadly left its place with the task group I don't know the number, remember the number of the task group, which was part of Admiral Mitchell's Fast Carrier Task Force group. One thing that concerned me was the burial of the dead. I sent a line officer, Lieutenant Commander Cabinet of Birmingham, emphasized Birmingham, Alabama, and the chaplain, who was a grand person and whom I had served with in Miami, or at Miami, Naval Air Station, and whom I had almost turned handsprings to get to become Birmingham's chaplain. I instructed them, with Cabinet in command, to identify every man before he was buried. I had visions for of what would happen if we hadn't gotten every man identified. That wives, sisters, mothers, sweethearts for years will be writing in, tell me, what do you know what happened to my son, husband, sweetheart, brother. So I emphasize, thank you, I emphasize to the pair the importance of getting the bodies properly identified. All night long, the work went on. The bodies had to be taken below where there was light, taken below from the darkened deck, below where there was light, and properly identified. Then taken back up in groups of 5 or 6 for burial at sea. As I say, that went on all night and into the next day. And I managed to attend one funeral service the next morning. But I can emphasize that every body was identified and duly recorded. At this time, on the morning of the 21st, a famous historic action occurred. The jeep carriers sent a message in plain language. I'm being attacked by enemy surface ships. Hello, Karen.
Now, we're ready again.
Then there occurred from that the message to Halsey, where is Task Force, I forget the number, but it was a task force of cruisers, destroyers, and battleships that was supposed to be formed out of, from Mitchell's Fast Carrier Task Force to fight a surface engagement with the Japanese. And they should have been there to intercept them before they got to the jeep carriers. And I will make comments on some of the things that happened. Admiral Nimitz wanted to know where Task Force so-and-so was. And the message added, all the world wants to know. And that was padding that was put in the message by the cryptographer. But somehow or other, in writing it up, it was made to appear part of the message. And Halsey thought it was Nimitz poking fun at him. And he threw his cap on the deck and was furious at the apparent slight. But in my opinion, Halsey really deserved it, because he had unwittingly fallen in with a Japanese plan, which was to lure the task force away from San Bernardino Strait to fight some carriers coming down from the Empire. This was part of what could have been a brilliant Japanese trick. Kincaid was lured down to fight the Japanese coming through in Leyte Gulf. The main body was coming through San Bernardino Strait, and Halsey was Fast Carrier Task Forces were supposed to be lured north to let the Central Force free and unlimited access to the Leyte beaches. It really worked. What happened to the Central Force after a punishing battle against the jeep carriers and destroyers? They had free access to the Leyte beaches. and they could have played havoc with the MacArthur's invasion force, destroying all of the ships in Lady at that time. It was a brilliant idea, and I have never seen a real explanation as to why the Japanese admiral in charge of the battleships failed to keep on to the later beaches. It was no part of Halsey's actions that spoiled the plan. And while the aviators are all for Halsey's 5-star promotion, I've always felt that it should have gone to Spruance. Spruance Chief of Staff, I once asked Spruance's Chief of Staff about that matter, and he said Spruance just wasn't interested in it. Even so, I think Spruance should have been forced to take the 5-star rank instead of Halsey. I'm afraid I am not a beacon bearer for Halsey, because he got his ships into 2 typhoons that he could have avoided by a simple change of course in good time, and saved the 3 destroyers that were sunk and the damage that was caused to other ships. That's just an estimate from my opinion of Bill Halsey. Well, one of Mrs. Taft's groups was left behind, needed refueling, and was ordered to Point Mick to refuel to take on the Japanese battleship task force. it seemed to me that Birmingham and its 3 destroyers en route to make should keep clear of it and not interfere with in any way with the refueling of the task group. Of Mitch's task group. It seemed to me that I remembered a fueling group with some jeep carriers entirely different from the ones involved in the plain English message. Seen in the Snoop file. It is the file that was sent for information, but not as action. I sent for the file and looked it up, and sure enough, there it was, within easy steaming distance, provided they were still there. Provided they were still there. So I changed course, told the destroyers why, and headed for this new fueling point. If within time to get back to Point Mick, I did not raise this new task group. I was going to turn back and go to Point Mick. But the next morning, the radar discovered planes orbiting about 100 miles away ahead of us. And the orbiting meant to me that they must be from that carrier group. So we continued on our way. And sure enough, by early afternoon, they came in sight. They proved to be of very great assistance to Birmingham. They sent over to stay with the ship several doctors and sent over certain supplies that valuable in treating wounded. Something that happened aboard Birmingham. An aviator who had lost a foot in the original explosion had treated it himself, put a tourniquet on it. He treated it and put a tourniquet on it himself. And according to the doctor, was doing very well. When he heard the firing to that plane coming in, he threw up his hands and said, "My God," and proceeded to die. We had no more adventures until we reached Ulysses. We went in and went alongside the hospital ship. I should know the name of it, but I don't. Forgotten it. And transferred the most seriously wounded to that ship. We had a little difficulty on arriving, be held up to let my memory's
Stop for it.
my memory's so fuzzy.
All right, it's back on.
There was a question about being held up to let Houston go in first. I protested it with our wounded we rated priority, and that was accepted. As for Houston, we had left Houston 10 days before, after the strike on Formosa, and she had been torpedoed and had to be towed. And first by a fellow cruiser, and then by I want to stop it. The cruisers turned the Houston over to fleet tugs, and they proceeded to get away from the forward area at the rate of 4 knots. And she was just arriving at Ulysses at the same time as we did. While I was alongside the hospital ship, comes around 10, the boss man of Ulysses, asked me if I could provide Houston with one anchor. Well, we had two. We could get by with one. So I said yes. So we roused up the port anchor, the starboard anchor, and so it put on a barge and taken away. So when that was done, we shoved off from the carrier to our own anchorage there in Ulysses. We got to the port, the navigator said, "This is it, we're here." So I said, "Let go." And they let go with a vengeance. There was the damage control outfit had been grievously cut up by the explosion, and they were green men at the anchor control, and he turned and attempted to put the brake on the chain, the anchor. He turned it the wrong way. With that, the chain continued blithely to roll out the hose pipes, and eventually the bitter end came up and went down the hose pipe into the drink. There we were with no anchor. Well, we buoyed the spot to go pick it up the next day, but it was too late in the afternoon now to do anything. We had to find a place for the ship to go. I reported it to Commander on 10, and the pilot says, "Roger, wait." But nothing happened, and darkness was coming on apace, so I sent a message to cruiser Boston. The skipper, Captain Herman, was a friend of mine, and told him our plight and asked if we could come alongside him. Promptly he said, "Give us 10 minutes and come alongside the port." So we went alongside Boston and doubled up the lines. By the time we had all doubled up, Commander on 10 said, "Go alongside Boston." I was tempted to send a sarcastic message back, but refrained. Just said, "We are alongside Boston." The next day, having discharged our most seriously wounded, our next goal was Mare Island Navy Yard. And I had no instructions other than to have the wounded taken care of and continue on my way. So the destroyers had been turned loose upon arrival in Ulysses, and the next morning at standard speed, I headed for the entrance and announced my intentions of proceeding to Pearl Harbor. And by the time that message had been transmitted, I was through the entrance and out at sea. So that ended Birmingham's interesting part of the events after the explosion. We passed a task force of cruisers a couple of days later and proceeded without other incidents to Pearl Harbor. Captain English was able to get up and walk about the deck the last 2 or 3 days, and I thought he would come to the bridge. But I am everlastingly grateful to Captain English for his complete confidence in me, and he never felt any need for him to show his presence on the bridge for the whole time until we anchored till we went alongside a pier at Mare Island Navy Yard. I was too junior to keep command, but I was prepared to volunteer to stay on as executive officer. Despite the fact that I was already on the list for captain. And the new skipper made a remark at a little party that I thought he was the meanest man in the world because he wouldn't let me go, and I was to be a captain as soon as I was detached. And however, he appreciated my willingness to take, but thought that I should take my promotion. So
Want me to stop a minute?
yeah. Right. Shortly thereafter, I was detached, and after giving a talk to the plank owners, plank on, you know, the plank on nails. Those in aboard when the ship's commissioned. And I sat down to my last meal aboard at lunch in a captain's uniform at the right hand of the commander de Bourg, the new exec. And I had my chance of commanding a transport or a supply ship, cargo ship. And transport is senior to this cargo ship, but it meant taking command out on the West Coast. The cargo ship meant taking command of the East Coast. And that made about 8 or 10 additional days of leave. So I decided to take the cargo ship. It was USS Woodford, and that proved to be a very happy choice. That's enough about Birmingham.